All right, everyone. Welcome to the STOA. Today we have Jay Springett with us. Jay is a consultant strategist who's currently specializing in the distributed web and metaverse. He's a podcast host of Permanently Moved, and he's one of the main thinkers in this thing called Solarpunk. And Solarpunk is one of the more hopeful memetic tribes that have emerged in recent years. I've been following them and really wanted to get Jay on since the STOA started, really. I'm a fan of his work. And it's cool with what's happening with the STOA lately, since the beginning, really, sort of being at the center of a lot of these emerging thinkers and movements that seemingly are converging onto something. So today's session is Solarpunk, a narrative strategy for a broken present, a memetic engine for a better world. And I'm going to tag in Jay in a moment. He's going to share his screen and present for about 20-30 minutes, and then we'll pivot for Q&A. We're here for about an hour in total. So if you have any questions at any time, drop them in the chat, and I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself, you ask a question to Jay during the Q&A portion. If you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that, and I'll read your question on your behalf. So that being said, Jay, welcome to the STOA, my friend.
Hiya, it's a pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone. So I am going to speak for about 30 minutes, maybe a bit less. Let me just share my screen. I won't be looking at the chat, by the way, while I'm speaking. Can everyone see that? I think so. Just thumbs up. Okay, cool. Right. Yeah, so that's me. I blog and have a newsletter and stuff at thejmo.net. I'm also a podcast host at permanentlymoved.online, which is a weekly show that I make, which is 301 seconds in length, so about 5 minutes. I try and fail to avoid Twitter, as I'm sure everyone tries to do as well. And if you're interested, my Solarpunk short story, In the Storm of Fire, in the anthology And Lately the Sun, was last year longlisted for the BSFA award for short fiction, and was also a semi-finalist in the Chanticleer International Book Awards. So if you want to check that out, please be my guest. And also, I've been an admin on solarpunks.net since 2014. So if you're expecting me to pin Solarpunk to a board today, like a butterfly, then this might not be the talk for you. I'm going to talk about Solarpunk as a narrative strategy and Solarpunk as a memetic engine. This talk also pairs well, I think, with the recent STOA session on Duma optimism. So kind of maybe there's some threads that cross over. So I'm going to speak for about 25 minutes, I reckon. But first, I must begin with one of Solarpunk's foundational principles, and that is polyphony, a texture consisting of multiple simultaneous lines of independent melody. Lines that are always in dialogue, sometimes in chorus or harmony, occasionally dissonant with one another. One cannot speak for other Solarpunks, only as one. Usually, when I'm giving a talk or being interviewed about Solarpunk, I reach for a go-to description. But in the last 18 months, Solarpunk has grown in the social imagination a lot. What was once a close-knit community of Tumblrs, mailing lists, and blogs in 2012-ish has become a sprawling, out-of-control container gaining momentum day by day, just as planned. As a result, some of you might have an awareness of Solarpunk, even just a little, and I assume that it might look like this. The current Google image search results. This presents the current edge of Solarpunk in the popular imagination. All concepts have an edge, and what the Jaya has thrown up and out is what we find at them. In this image, you can also see quite a lot of eco-modernist greenwashing images that have been confused by the popular imagination for Solarpunk. This isn't anyone's fault. Things blend and merge at the edge. Concepts also have gravity. These are the images that are currently in stable orbit around the concept that is Solarpunk. And of course, the concept's gravity is always stronger as you get closer to the center of the Jaya. Solarpunk also has a very simple test for images out here on the edge. Which one of these images is the most Solarpunk? The answer is, of course, the one on the right. A Solarpunk future is always the one with people in it. My usual line is that Solarpunk is a movement in art, fashion, technology, and activism that seeks to answer and embody the question, what does a sustainable civilization look like and how do we get there? Perhaps that one-liner is better, perhaps as a one-liner, Solarpunk is better as en route to a better world. Solarpunk attempts to imagine solutions to live comfortably without fossil fuels, to equitably manage scarcity and share abundance, to be kinder to each other and the planet that we share. It is once a vision of the future, a thoughtful provocation, and an achievable lifestyle. Whilst I'm not addressing this today, the solar in Solarpunk also means solar as in power. Solarpunk sees infrastructure as a site of potential resistance. In 2014, the late mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, Choke Lumumba, said that dealing with infrastructure is a protection against being robbed of one's self-determination. And as an aside, I recently made a podcast on the blizzard and the grid disaster in Texas as a real life Solarpunk story. So if you want to go check that out, be my guest. In 2016, solarpunkanarchist.com appeared with the extremely SEO-friendly essay, What is Solarpunk? And described it as practical utopianism, an eco-futurist movement that tries to think our way out of catastrophe by imagining a future most people would like to live in instead of the ones that we should be trying to avoid. Solarpunk aims to cancel the apocalypse. If Solarpunk is about stories en route to a better world, then we should probably ask, en route from where? Whoops. The present is broken. We are caught between the immediate extreme present of Schumann Bassar's new book, Emotional Capitalism, or one that's too slow, too full of inertia, unable to process or engage with the fast-moving crises that we face. The recent IPCC report has given us until 2035 to turn the ship around. What's worse is that visions of the future in our collective imagination are actually somebody else's. They're not our own future. The game Cyberpunk 2077 is still selling us an idea of the future that is nearly 40 years old. Mark Fisher wrote in Ghost of My Life in 2014 that it doesn't feel like the future, or alternatively, it doesn't feel as if the 21st century has started yet. We remain trapped in the 20th century. The slow cancellation of the future has been accompanied by the deflation of expectations. Around the time that Fisher wrote these words, I joined solarpunks.net with a bunch of other people also trying to think about the future in a new way. In 2012, Adam Flynn had written the essay on the blog entitled On the Need for New Futures. We are starved for visions of the future that will sustain us and give us something to hope for. Ideas for life beyond the rusted chrome of yestermorrow, or nightmarish realms of radiated men eating the flesh of other radiated men. I think he echoes Fisher's lament. According to filmstories.com, there are currently 108 reboots, remakes, and sequels in various phases of production. This is mind-boggling. We're stuck in a steady state cultural imagination. Due to copyright, our culture treats narratives, myth, and shared social imagination as a commodity. The stories that influence our imagination are things to be bought and sold. Mass culture, I believe, runs on what I call cultural grammars, essentially shared expectations in narrative. New cultural products have to reference something from a time when everyone shared mass culture to continue to make money, when their business model still worked. So before the internet, basically. Disney just spent $200 million on a film based on a ride, for God's sake. This movie represents the current denouement of a phenomenon that I call cultural fracking. The process of extracting new value out of the sedimentary layers of meaning that compromise mass culture from the past. In order to profitably mine and stable expectations from the wider cultural imagination, mainstream culture has to continually frack the past to create future material. It's not that the reboots, remakes, and nostalgic mashups like Ready Player One are unoriginal. It's just the logic of media produced under narrative monopoly. To reappropriate Gramsci, the future can't escape the broken present because the corpse of the old is being constantly resuscitated to perform again and again on stage. Let us quickly take a tour through the kinds of visions of the future that we are currently being sold. There's 2001 space realism, Ad Astra, Interstellar, and films like The Martian are essentially a survival Western, but with added space and more science. Or there's retro futures like Tomorrowland that borrow from the 1950s, Lost in Space and Jetsons aesthetics. Sometimes, like in Fallout, a retro 50s future is remixed with post-apocalyptic fears from the Cold War. or straight up post-apocalyptic movies are rebooted to reference ecological collapse instead of the fears around peak oil. And then, of course, there's the MCU, filled with characters created more than half a century ago. It's undeniable that Disney is fracking every penny from its $4.2 billion purchase of the commodity known as Marvel. Consider the types of stories that they are selling. In a time of urgent collective action needed on climate change, biosphere collapse, and mass migration and other global scale challenges, we are getting narratives of individual superheroes or saviors. Stories about figures that are above or perhaps beyond humanity coming to save the day. In the real world, of course, no one is coming to save us. This has not gone unseen. Alan Moore said in an interview back in 2014 that to his mind, this embracing of what were unambiguously children's characters in the mid-20th century seems to indicate a retreat from the admittedly overwhelming complexities of modern existence. Solarpunk then is a collective attempt to think beyond the cultural condition that Fisher diagnosed as capitalist realism, the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible to imagine a coherent alternative to it. The stories we tell shape and define our desires. Late capitalism's urge to control desire is one of the ways in which it defutures our imaginations, the closing down of possibilities, the shutting down of routes out, nothing beyond the present condition. No futures or imaginative realms beyond those that can be bought and sold. I personally believe that defuturing has contributed greatly to the meaning crisis, trapping us within steady state cultural imagination. I'm a solarpunk then because the only other options are denial or despair. So what do I mean by solarpunk as narrative strategy? Last year, the writer and academic Sijia Hartman said that so much of the work of oppression is about policing the imagination. So Solarpunk's role, in some sense, is to provide a space and perhaps permission to those who wish to think past the defuturing tendencies of capitalist realism. In 2011, Cyberpunk author Neil Stephenson proposed that fictional versions of the future act as hieroglyphs, simple, recognizable symbols on whose influence everyone can agree upon. Stevenson later teamed up with Arizona State University to create Project Hieroglyph, an attempt to crowdsource ideas and symbols that puncture our malaise. Contributing to the project in 2014, Adam Flynn wrote the important essay, Solarpunk, Notes Towards a Manifesto. Solarpunk, he thought, could act as a big idea that does more than just act as a symbol. We need these big futures in new directions towards things beyond cool toys for rich people. We are trying to make Solarpunk a concept, an aesthetic, a design fiction movement, a setting for roleplay games, because we need banners to rally around, and there is power in forming subcultures around these ideas. So drawing inspiration from Le Guin's carrier bag theory of fiction, Solarpunk asks, what if we together, collectively, create a container that could be used by anyone to place their ideas about the future inside? And what sort of stories could that container, with the things it contained, create? Solarpunk emerged on social networks, and as a result, the mechanisms and logic of these networks are inherent inside it as a container. Because of the nature of the feed, in Solarpunk, ideas are always in juxtaposition. Think of clicking beyond that Google image search result and falling into Solarpunk Tumblr or Solarpunk Reddit. An image of a lean-to greenhouse next to a post on appropriate technology for water harvesting alongside a rendering of a retrofitted suburbia. At its core, Solarpunk is about placing ideas in relation to one another, a process of conceptual bricolage, inspiring people by creating polyphonic future texture. For a lot of people, Solarpunk is shorthand for an aesthetic. Many teenagers use aesthetic as an all-purpose adjective, that's so aesthetic, as shorthand for that's so aesthetically pleasing to me. But in broader internet parlance, it now means a collection of signifiers, or more precisely, a vibe. What emerges from Solarpunk's conceptual bricolage is the vibe. In January, my other internet colleague, John Palmer, coined the term scissor label. A scissor label is a word or a phrase that for the first time establishes a widely embraced name for a trend without simultaneously establishing a canonical definition. It is a vague term masquerading as a specific one. A scissor label is established. Controlling its definition means controlling whatever the trend represents. Solarpunk actively tries to resist simple definitions. It keeps its edges blurry on purpose. I'll admit this results in a frustration from parts of the internet who like their fandoms pinned and labeled under glass on a board. But Solarpunk is about individuals imagining what a sustainable civilization might look like and how do we get there. Writing in 2015, speculative fiction writer Andrew Danner Hudson also noted the necessity of Solarpunk as Scissor's label to escape clear definition. What is Solarpunk? I hesitate to define it and therefore limit it for the thousands now exploring its possibilities. The first Solarpunk anthology was published in Brazilian Portuguese in 2012, Ecological and Fantastical Stories in a Sustainable World. This book was part of a series. Atempunk and Dieselpunk followed. Simply by their names, these dash punks reserved a space at the table alongside other punk genres. Most people, upon encountering the term solarpunk, of course, make the comparison with its grandfather, cyberpunk. So what then was cyberpunk about? 35 years on from its inception, it too has become an aesthetic or a vibe. Heavy rain and harsh neon, cool robot limbs and VR goggles. The genre's big symbols like cyberspace and the metaverse have transcended their role as symbolic warnings and for many have become hyperstitional prophecies. Cyberpunk was about the way technology shoves life into ever-increasing levels of abstraction, like cyberspace. It was about the rise of corporate power, ubiquitous computation, and greed. It was about the politics of the 1980s, urban decay and globalization, the rise of zero-tolerance policing, anxieties around healthcare, and the psychological toll of the Cold Forever War, and the possibility of nuclear annihilation. But today, things are far worse. The existential threat of climate change and the possibility, but today things are far worse. The existential threat of climate change and biosphere collapse looms over all of our futures. Frederick Jameson observed in 1982 that the role of science fiction was not to imagine the future so much as to defamiliarize and restructure the experience of our own present, and to do so in specific ways. Cyberpunk's foundational texts held a deeply cynical view of the future alongside a call for resistance. The genre and its aesthetic trappings, as the genre and its aesthetic trappings accreted, its politics were worn away by this cultural passage, leaving with us what it is today, just an aesthetic vibe and setting for buggy video games. So what is Solarpunk about right now? Well, Solarpunk is about finding ways to make life more wonderful. Solarpunk is about finding ways to make life more wonderful for us right now, and more importantly, for generations that follow us, i.e. extending human life at the species level rather than individually. Imagine permaculturalists thinking in cathedral time. Solarpunk's putting ideas in juxtaposition can be seen as far back as 2014. As Flynn wrote, as it stands, it's a mashup of the following: 1800s Age of Sail, frontier living, but with more bicycles, creative use of existing infrastructure, sometimes post-apocalyptic, sometimes present weird, Jugyard-style innovation from the developing world, high-tech backends with simple, elegant outputs. This conceptual bricolage can also be found at Miss Olivia Louise's massively viral Tumblr post from the same year. Natural colors, Art Nouveau, handcrafted wares, tailors and dressmakers, streetcars, airships, stained glass windows, solar panels, education in tech and food growing, solar rooftops and roadways, communal greenhouses, renewable energy powered Art Nouveau styled tech life. It goes on. In both posts, you can see a rearrangement of past, present, and future, but it's important to note that it's not the Art Nouveau itself that makes it solarpunk. If Art Nouveau references become an aesthetic shorthand for utopian future, they'll become another consumable trope for the wealthy to cling to. Solarpunk will not and cannot mean one thing, no matter how memeified it becomes. It is forever open for adoption and appropriation. In the constant spawning of new worlds and new futures, in doing this, Solarpunk's fuzzy-edged and always in the process of renewal. Without renewal, Solarpunk is in danger of boxing itself in aesthetically. Solarpunk is about the here and now. Its texture made up of things that already exist in the world, projecting them forwards. A food forest on every street and a water filter in every home. It's about finding ourselves temporally as well. As Flynn observed back in 2012, one of the most curious facts about living as we do today is that our future does not exist, strictly speaking. Our philosophy of history has more or less collapsed. We are confronted with a dizzying arrays of signals, strong and weak, fair and foul. Solarpunk's polyphonic thinking is not sequential, and this is why it eschews an official canon. I often struggle to point people towards one single book or novel and say that is Solarpunk. Instead, there's lots of anthologies. Each book contains multiple voices and visions of the future, and each story and point of view in juxtaposition with one another. Each story adding to the texture, each book in turn contributing to the vibe. Writing on Solarpunk in the Open Library of Humanities, Dr. Rhys Williams observed Solarpunk as a container. Usually, the conceptual space named Solarpunk emerged prior to the narratives that are now gradually giving it substance. And much of Solarpunk happens outside the published stories. Solarpunk is a world first and a set of narratives second. Drawing inspiration from Williams's use of the word world and substituting for it as container, we can reframe Solarpunk's Scissor label as an exercise in collective world building. Not a single shared world, but multiple worlds and multiple futures. In 2010, in the 2010 speech, Atemporality for the Creative Artist, Bruce Sterling encouraged us all to become multi-temporal rather than multicultural. It used to be a problem that historians could not divide themselves from the outlooks and interests of their own age. And I think we are approaching a situation where the outlooks and interests of our own age make very little sense. So as a product of the network world, Solarpunk also uses multi-temporality to its advantage. The present that we live in now is conceptually is a consequence of our past, and in turn, the future will be a product of our present. And in our own present, we have many, many concerns. To face these challenges, we must look to the past as well as the future. There is much good work happening to decolonize, recontextualize, and resituate history, to retell the narratives that we tell ourselves about the past in the present. Solarpunk tries to provide space for indigenous sovereignties, reproductive justice, and radical queer politics, etc., recasting ideas alongside the contemporary, projecting their arrangement forward for better or for worse. Cory Doctorow, echoing Jameson, said that science fiction isn't predictive of the future and that it tends to be about diagnosing our current aspirations and anxieties. At its best, Solarpunk dislocates itself from the present, a new experience of the world with all the possibilities that exist today. Solarpunk is about the speculative present, some doom or optimism, as it were. This looks like walking down the street with a head full of concepts introduced via its narrative strategy, permaculture techniques, and urban planning. The speculative present is wondering why a local piece of scrubland is underutilized as a space for a local community food forest. It is being able to imagine that the dead patch of grass next to the mall is a site for rewilding, both sites for both real and narrative possibility. Kerry Facer uses a similar term, the thick present. Ideas of the future shape what is experienced in the present, and the experience of the present shapes ideas about the past, and the reading of the past informs ideas of future possibility. One of Solarpunk's maxims is to move quietly and plant things, to engage in activity in the margins. All of these interventions, like appropriate technologies, permaculture, water harvesting, gardening, all become strategic narratives from within the larger narrative strategy. Your street, back garden, or apartment all become real-world sites for these strategic narratives, where we can test and prototype our ideas of a better future whilst asking a better future for whom? Writer and theorist Paul Graham Raven, in his essay Ways of Telling Tomorrows, makes the case that the utility of science fiction is to provide us with a sandbox today where ideas and solutions might be tested to destruction without consequence. Science fiction author Madeline Ashby's advice is to talk loudly and frequently and in detail about the future that you want, because you can't manifest what you don't share. It is in discussing the future loudly and in detail that we can test Raven's sandboxes. In 2018, comics writer and author Warren Ellis introduced me to the term refuturing. Just as rewilding is to the landscape, refuturing is to the imagination. The sense of creating new immediate futures and repopulating the future space with something entirely divorced from the previous consensus futures. If futuring is shape the possibility space for action, to refuture is to encourage and cultivate the qualities of futuring in the minds of people who encounter Solarpunk. The creation of speculative presence allows us to resist the defuturing processes of steady-state capitalist realism by the generation of new, plausible worlds. One of the conditions of John Palmer's scissor labels is that they be maximally divisive. By nature, scissor labels have a peculiar divisive power, building energy and momentum around a trend while simultaneously bringing about controversy and debate. The telltale sign of such a conversation is that it's rooted in a strict binary orientation, primarily about what it is or isn't part of trend X. When this happens, X is most likely to be a scissor label. The answer isn't binary. Scissor labels are only scissor labels as long as there's something at stake, because narrative control is a form of power. Now remember, Solarpunk tries to keep its edges blurry, undefinable. And in a recent conversation with John, I concluded that Solarpunks are not so strictly scissor labels. They are instead memetic. It is instead a memetic engine, a narrative strategy for producing strategic narratives. Memetic engines are narrative containers that are productive and share their yield with its participants, a narrative space that appeals to people's better selves, an engine that powers the refuturing of participants' imaginations. And memetic engines are always questions asking for answers. Those answers can undergo reformation and disruption without changing the initial question. Memetic engines are ideas for producing more ideas. Those ideas must affect the world beyond the boundaries of its container. And it's my belief that we can feel our way out of the mess of the early 21st century via the creation of a generous memetic engines. They're about giving more possibility back to the world than they close down. To conclude, writing in the LA.RB in 2018, Rhys Williams wrote the following on Solarpunk. Solarpunk is better categorized as a kaleidoscopic manifesto, an argument in story and image, the song of a community both incoherent and coalescing, simultaneously committed and finding its feet. There is no guarantee this will lead anywhere, that it will grow or thrive or influence culture and thinking as a whole, but the Solarpunk community and its stance make up a positive force in the current struggle. Here's to the light. Action can only ever take place in the present. And speaking last year, Andati Roy was asked what lies ahead. And she said, reimagining the world, only that. Thanks. Stop sharing.
Awesome. Well done. Quite enjoyed that presentation. A lot of delicious new terminology as well.
Yeah. So I've written and spoke about this elsewhere on the internet. So if you want more in detail in each of these concepts, please seek it out.
Cool. So feel free to start putting your questions in the chat. I'll warm up Jay with a question of my own. Yeah, one thing that is salient for me is sort of the existential hope aspect of Solarpunk. And perhaps fellow travelers like Doomer Optimism or Metamodernism or Game B.
Yeah,
there's sort of like a vibe between all those sort of nomadic tribes where they have the existential hope, and they're not coming from like a shaming place, where it seems like the tribes that are either on the far left or far right or right or left, they have a kind of a shame aspect about them. Also, then they have this sort of, what Mark Fisher calls reflective impotence, whereas like they know the world is fucked, and then it's like, can't do anything about it. So it's like a self-fulfilling or world-fulfilling prophecy. So yeah, perhaps you can speak on sort of the ecology of nomadic tribes that have that sort of vibe, that kind of configuration of the existential hope and a lack of shaming essence to it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually. Before I kind of came to Solarpunk or heard the word for the first time, I was actually was part of Dark Mountain and really influenced by Dark Mountain's writing. And one of the lessons for me through kind of that whole experience of the Dark Mountain project was the need for new narratives and new stories. And it was partly my frustration actually with that negative kind of attitude towards things that I really wanted to push back against, and I felt that was is somewhat utopian or hopeful in the optimism that is inside Solarpunk. And I think, and what for the reason is for me is that the world is definitely fucked, and if you look out the window, it's not Eden, and that planting a garden and communities taking care of their environment, both personally, anyone can have plants on their windowsill, and then you scale up from there. Like there's a whole section of this talk that I didn't include, or it's like a thread from a kind of a different talk, where, I mean, Solarpunk is punk, and it is, it is a reaction to the larger, to the larger, what's it called? Cultural trend, which is that everything is fucked. so kind of like the rebellion of the punk in Solarpunk is exactly that, is that taking this optimism and wanting to channel that energy and do something with it.
Yeah. Yeah, just the terms that you dropped, refuturing, I'm just like geeking out about that one still. That's definitely one in my Memetic toolbox.
Yeah, that's a great term.
Yeah. So we'll take in people. We have a bunch of questions already. Nicholas, if you could ask your question.
Hey, Jay, thanks so much for doing this. This was great.
Hey, no worries.
Yeah, definitely a lot of, I mean, so many things. Jock Fresco, Miyazaki, Society of the Spectacle, Guy Debord, so many things. But one of the things, obviously, we've seen with culture and institutions, especially with some of these newer movements, cryptocurrency, the internet being the best examples recently. But like I loved your term strategic narratives, because that seems to be like taking the real world, action to theory or from theory. And like, how do you navigate institutions from the past, like trying to co-opt the movement? Because as you said, like Solarpunk is not exactly defined from the beginning. It's going to be loose. It's going to be that. And so how do we keep the core true to Solarpunk, or at least keep evolving in the Solarpunk, nature, rather than getting co-opted, bastardizing, et cetera? Because, institutions, all these people are going to try and co-opt it as it comes. So that's all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we think about like the psychic, the media landscape in some kind of like psychic economy, then Solarpunk is just a new commodity to invest in some sense from like the larger media institutions. I think that Solarpunk as a community, in some sense, has a little bit of a poison pill, in that if you want to co-opt the aesthetics of Solarpunk as they stand right now, then Solarpunk can choose a different aesthetic, like I was saying about Art Nouveau. And there was a lot of discussion. I mean, obviously, if you want to call something Solarpunk, then be prepared for its politics to come along with it. Because, I mean, the Reddit group is doing a Murray Bookchin reading group right now. And I mean, there's thousands of people, thousands of people are reading Murray Bookchin. So, I mean, like, if you want to call something Solarpunk, then, all of that, you're taking on you are taking on, in some sense, some sort of like mimetic or narrative solidarity with the wider Solarpunk movement, rather than just its aesthetics. And then I guess one of the other things that I would say is that there was that, I actually included it in the talk as a background image. There was a Chobani advert. There's that Greek yogurt advert, right? And one of the other admins on Solarpunk hadn't heard of Chobani, because they like live somewhere else. And then they looked into it, and Chobani is probably the only company out there that could possibly be the one that uses Solarpunk, because it's like partly worker owned, and it gives like loads of money to charity, and it was founded by Kurdish immigrants and so on and so forth. And I thought that was actually really interesting, that the first company that we've seen that actually decides to use Solarpunk as a kind of like marketing strategy, or at least align itself with that, is a company that has this history and background. And as a comment, I thought that was interesting. But I also don't know how we stop it from getting co-opted. I mean, there is also like
Any follow-up thoughts, Nicholas?
The only thing really to follow up would be to just how, I guess, could we as a community, because then it, I guess, comes to the users, it comes up to us being, and that, like you said, the Reddit community around and sticking to our politics. So I guess how then, instead of the institutions, how do we as a people and the users and whatever not also get co-opted by other means and stuff to, to keep on Solarpunk, and then to, I guess, just be more disciplined? I don't know if that's the word.
I honestly think it's to talk loudly and in detail about the future. And if you don't want that, then also speak loudly. Do you know what I mean?
Cool. Thanks, Nicholas. Let's take in Max. Max, you had a question.
Hi, Jay. It seems like Cyberpunk has some kind of purely atheistic, materialistic underlining. So what will be the equivalent of Solarpunk? Is it like potentially Gaia-nist or return to the sun god ID? Or if you're so familiar with many stories that have been written on Solarpunk, what are the spiritual patterns, the spiritual underlining to those stories?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I should have actually brought out my box of Solarpunk stuff, because one of the first pieces of Solarpunk media that was produced that came out of Tumblr was actually a zine that was called Solarpunk as Fuck. And the first issue was on the sacred. And like some of the bigger blogs around Solarpunk that have been around for a long time is Solarpunk Witchcraft, for example. And there's a whole bunch of others, but Solarpunk Witchcraft is one of those handles that like springs to mind off the top of my head. I would say, so there is a really good, I'm gonna have to Google it. You'll have to excuse me. Rob Cameron is the guy that wrote the essay. And so he wrote an essay last year for the new modality called Promised Land, Religious Ideology and Solarpunk Science Fiction. It's really worth reading because that's actually an in-depth critique of Solarpunk, where it stands at the moment. And one of those things is that it lacks religion, or not religion, but, you know, a connecting spiritual element. And one of the things that he argues is that if Solarpunk is serious about being a space for indigenous thought and so on and so forth, then as a science fiction, that it shouldn't be squeamish around, kind of like breaking out of materialism, even though it does like, but what's more interesting to me is that the very first English language anthology about Solarpunk is called The Anthology of Dragons. And that particular anthology, you kind of see the dragon as a metaphor for spirituality and magic coming back into the world, and in some sense also representing the sun and the utilization of power, the solar power, at least in my kind of amateur kind of reading of it. But yeah, I mean, there is a lot in there. I really recommend reading the Rob Cameron essay. And if you're seeking kind of the spiritual side of Solarpunk or stories with spirituality in them, to be honest, the answer is to write your own. You know, like that's what Solarpunk's really all about.
Any follow-up thoughts, Max?
Yeah, I'm totally game on that actually, because I've been pondering upon the Writers of the Future contest. I've wrote some story, but yeah, trying to steer away from like apocalyptic punk and so on. But yeah, I think there's
I have a Solarpunk novel, or not a novel, a short story that's I haven't managed to sell, but it's about a Solarpunk baker who is in a business partner with the yeast in his that makes the bread, basically. And the bread in some sense he has kind of a spiritual connection with the yeast because he started the starter on a certain saint's day, and it's kind of like this animistic Catholic Solarpunk future thing. It's a bit of a weird story, but yeah.
I will see like neo-shamanistic type of stories, like a return to like the sun as a god,
I mean, just go for it. Like, just write whatever you want.
Yeah. Cool, but thanks for the inspiration.
Yeah, no worries.
And we have a morning writing kind of club at the Stoa, so perhaps anyone wants to get their writing on, Solarpunk writing on, you can do it there.
You should do an anthology, Peter.
Maybe we might do that. Dario, you had a question. I think I pronounced your name Dara. Are you there?
Yes, it's Dara. Let me just turn on my screen. I think I was having a bit of an issue. Can you guys hear me just fine?
Yep.
Awesome.
Nice to meet
Okay.
you.
Awesome. Hi, nice to meet you. Awesome to hear from you. Yeah, my question was more directed as to the fact that since this is reimagining the future, how can we do that while boosting voices from the global south and also lower income communities? Because I see that we're trying to reimagine it outside of the framework that we've been given with our current global paradigm. And I see that this is an amazing way to just boost and re-vindicate so much indigenous culture that has been, you know, lashed out to the side, being told this isn't worth re-exploring. And yeah, if there's anyone you want to suggest that we check out that's doing this kind of stuff, that would also be great.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I actually cut my original draft of this talk was like 6,000 words. So like there's a whole bunch of stuff that I wanted to say that I didn't. First of all, it's really important that Solarpunk is like wants to make space for all of these voices kind of within its community. And I was on a panel about Afrofuturism, and one of the questions from the audience was about appropriation. And obviously this is just my opinion. There is a difference between holding ideas in relation or in juxtaposition with one another than taking ideas and then taking them for your own. For example, I think there's a big difference in that, in the way that new ideas are generated. And secondly, all of the Solarpunk publishers who have published all of those anthologies that I showed on screen are all committed to publishing voices in translation. And that, I think, is one of the kind of most important parts of the Solarpunk as a community, let's say, as in the wider community of publishers, you know, people who are like getting the books out there, is that as part of their commitment to raising up voices that need to be heard is publishing fiction in translation from other languages to English, and also vice versa. There are anthologies that are all in Brazilian Portuguese. There's multiple Brazilian, like, that I've never read. There's Italian future fiction in Italy, for example, publish a lot of fiction in Italian, but it's global, like Solarpunk sci-fi. A lot of Sino future writers, and they also got a Chinese anthology coming out soon as well with unpublished material. So I think that's also really interesting, is that not only within the community, but the kind of the infrastructure that the Solarpunk community accesses, you need to have, because the primacy of the English language is a big problem within, you know, all fandoms, in my opinion. So yeah, I mean, and that's like another thing that I would add. I would check out the work of Ana Rush. She's a Brazilian sci-fi author who also kind of is involved in the publishing of various things. And she's also working on indigenous Brazilian food cultures and sci-fi. And I believe there's stuff in the works there as well.
Any follow-up thoughts, Dara?
No, none. Yeah, it's important to, as you said, translate and try to bring things to the forefront if we can. And it's definitely been enriching. Thank you.
Awesome. Reed, you had a question.
Yeah. So I'll just read it. This is all new to me, so thanks for the presentation. I really like the aesthetics of Solarpunk, but I'm having, like, I guess, a difficult time kind of wrapping my head around what it means, which actually seems to be part of the point. So my question is, as terminology intending to stay broad and avoid capture, what advantages or distinctions does Solarpunk as a memetic engine have over Game B? It seems to me that Solarpunk kind of seems to be a Game B, but almost like a narrowing of a particular answer to an energy answer and some kind of anti-establishment attitude combined with that. Yeah.
That is a good question. I wouldn't necessarily I would put Solarpunk in juxtaposition with Game B and then decide, like, what new ideas can those two think, like Solarpunk and Game B, what do those two things sort of like, what do those things generate in your own mind, I guess is a question back to you. But further to that, Solarpunk, I mean, when people started talking about Solarpunk in 2012, it's important to remember that there was no optimistic sci-fi at all. Like it literally didn't exist until, and Solarpunk is, in my opinion, one of the primary forces that has been pushing for more optimistic narratives in sci-fi. Like, and I don't think that we would be where we are without them, without Solarpunk kind of year by year growing and growing and growing and building in the public consciousness. And I mean, as a memetic engine, like the point for me is that if you discover Solarpunk and read a Solarpunk novel or anthology, there are a few Solarpunk novels, the best Solarpunk is the stuff that's set 5 minutes in the future. And the world building is all permacultural techniques. It's stuff like keyline design, it's agroforestry. Like there's a couple of great stories that are set on regenerative ag farms, for example. There's a great murder mystery, but I can't remember what it's called. You know, and as part of the world building, it's kind of showing those kind of techniques or bits of information that are actually useful in your own life. In some sense, it's kind of propaganda for all of these appropriate technologies that are either overlooked or kind of underknown about. It's like smuggling all of these things in. You know, there's one story that I read online, which isn't in an anthology, but I can't remember where I read it. But basically, half the story is basically a conversation around turning compost. And whilst it's a bit tell don't show, it literally explains how to make compost, like as part of the story, which I think is kind of like what's good about how Solarpunk works. I know I didn't quite answer your question about Game B, but I think there's more going on than just having a single narrative about what we should do or whatever.
Any follow-up thoughts, Reed?
Yeah, that's really interesting. What I'm hearing you say is that Solarpunk is kind of trying to avoid narrative warfare by saying Solarpunk is about permaculture, because then it just kind of acts as like a.
Or Solarpunk includes permaculture rather than saying it's about Solarpunk.
Right.
It's about permaculture. Do you know what I mean? It's like it's because ideas are always in juxtaposition. It's up for an individual who is into Solarpunk to decide what is Solarpunk within the container or the theory object of that particular term that is Solarpunk.
Right. And would I be right in understanding that the concept of permaculture is kind of, it's not, Solarpunk isn't about permaculture, but concepts within permaculture.
Yeah, permacultural concepts are pretty Solarpunk. You know what I mean?
That's great. I like that a lot. Thanks very much. Appreciate the answer.
Awesome. Adam, you had a question earlier. You can unmute yourself.
Hi there. Yeah, I really love this talk. So thank you very much. And one point that kind of piqued my interest midway through was when you casually mentioned buggy video games as a source of Solarpunk expression. So I was just curious what you thought was the role of simulation in fleshing out some of these ideas, as opposed to some of the narratives and images coming off of the blogs from earlier in the decade. Because the first thing that got me interested in Solarpunk was this idea of hardening and tempering environmental science into an engineering discipline, basically. So I wonder what you think the role of systems thinking and essentially code and simulation in making Solarpunk futures mechanistic has to do with what's going on here.
Well, I mean, a little bit of my answer is I spent the last 2 years writing a book called Land as Platform, which is entirely around this particular subject, around kind of data and simulation and kind of global planetary management in a way. And I'm also working with companies that I can't actually tell you about. I'm not really sure that I can answer this question on the STOA. But if you want to email me through my contact, I'll get back to you, I'm afraid.
Okay, that's exciting. And then also whether you can recommend any buggy game projects that you've come across on Twitter that might,
So the itch.io Solarpunk Jam just finished, or is finishing like this weekend coming. Just go check out, like there's a whole bunch of cool games, and there's an RPG there was a paper and pencil RPG game jam that ran at the same time. So yeah, just go have a look for those kind of things. There's also a thing that I found extremely inspiring. One of the other admins posted a LiDAR mapping of a rewilded railway in France. And it was like a pointillist artwork, but you could download the full geometry if you wanted, and it looks amazing. And I found that image, like as an image, really inspiring. And yeah, there's another guy that made a Solarpunk like level in Dreams as well, that went super viral recently.
Thank you, Adam. We'll probably sneak in one more question. Jonathan, you just had a question in the chat.
Yeah, sure. Hi. Well, I'm wondering, like most of the things you've been talking about is all about narrative and aesthetics, or like, I guess, fashion, game stories, books, so on. But are there any like real life communities trying to implement Solarpunk explicitly? And like, is that something you want for the moment, or is that making it too like concrete?
So I actually had to cut a bunch of stuff out of the talk. Maybe I should have gone for 40 minutes instead of 30. However, Solarpunk has a yearly thing called Solarpunk Action Week, which has been going for years and years and years. And basically, one of the things that I like to say is to LARP as a Solarpunk is to go plant a garden, basically, like, or to LARP as a Solarpunk is to join a community group that's like planting trees in the park. And there are communities of people that call themselves Solarpunks, like, and those people are people that are living on ships with no power, decentralized internet infrastructure, like mesh networks on the harbor. Secure Scuttlebutt, the communications platform, that the Solarpunk at one point was the biggest channel, and I know that a few of the developers of that also have called themselves Solarpunk. People that have been involved in guerrilla gardening, people who do food forests in the middle of their cities, that are people who like edible, like incredible edible at Todd Morden, for example, is like a good example of what people who are into Solarpunk are doing in their own towns. People are making seed libraries and old phone boxes. I mean, there's all sorts of things that and all of these examples that I'm giving are what are strategic narratives. There are actually like, I can do something to make the world a better place right now, and therefore like that's a strategic narrative, basically, is all of the, essentially, hopefully the propaganda that is Solarpunk teaches people that they can actually do stuff. And then they it piques their interest. People might get into growing food on their balcony or whatever. You know what I mean? Like that's the one of the goals, I guess.
Any follow-up thoughts, Jonathan?
No, I think I just like, focus on the simple growing stuff instead of like complex extracting value stuff. So thank you.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Let's see. Anjan, did you have any questions? You had a bunch of shares in the chat.
Yeah, hey, thanks for the presentation. I guess for me, Solarpunk has mainly been about the images, and they're hella inspiring, and they're mostly what I've seen is kind of architecture or kind of like Vista images.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's like a good link or a good place I could just find more images about like maybe like socializing and families and like a house, technology, food, kind of the other aspects of life, if there's good images.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I kind of alluded to this at the beginning, is that like Solarpunk images of the future are the ones with people in them, as opposed to like those vistas or those eco-modernist or eco-brutalist images that like frequently get used on large websites when they write articles about Solarpunk, hence the kind of Google image search results. Honestly, there is a Dutch author who wrote a book, who did a whole book of Solarpunk illustrations, and his name escapes me, but it's called like Solarpunk Universitas or something like that. And that's a really good place to look. But in general, you kind of, if you want to find images like that from concept artists and, you know, fan artists and stuff, you just need to get past the edge of those vistas and kind of be in the community. Just follow Solarpunk as a term on Tumblr, or hang out in the subreddit or something. I mean, ArtStation's got loads of great images as well, but yeah, you just got to go look rather than I can point you anywhere. They're just in amongst the texture of, I mean, I've been following Solarpunk for 10 years now, so it's just like a fabric.
Yeah, one thing I'm amazed at how long it's been around, and you know, the kind of a lot of the rich contributions. I wasn't aware of that. So any closing thoughts you'd like to leave us with, Jay, or anything that we can, if anyone's interested in joining the Solarpunk communities or following your work, where could they go?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to follow my work, it's all at thejmo.net, and that's also my Twitter handle. If you want to kind of, if you're interested in Solarpunk, I think there's a couple of things that you can actually do, and that's, first of all, like, start a Pinterest, or like, obviously you can join the Reddit or follow it on Tumblr. But Solarpunk Pinterest is huge. I had absolutely no idea how big that social network is. But yeah, I mean, I guess one of the points of Solarpunk is, if you want to be involved in it, it's about building your own future, about what you want to see. So collecting images and ideas and articles, and yeah, putting them out in the world, sharing them with the hashtag.
Awesome. So I'll include Jay's website and links on the video for those watching on YouTube. And I'll make some closing announcements in a moment. But Jay, thank you so much for coming to the STOA. That was a wonderful presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
Treat to have you. Love to have you back. So upcoming events at the STOA tomorrow. Alex Ebert, he's this famous musician that won like Golden Globe Awards and part of the Edwin Sharp and Memetic Zeros. He's actually a secret philosopher. And he's coming for a session tomorrow called A Theory of Fucking Everything. So it's like a theory of everything, but has sex involved in it apparently. So that's tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern time. Adrienne Maria Brown, who's a feminist author on topics of transformative justice and pleasure activism, is coming in September 16th at 2 p.m. Eastern time for our emergent strategy. Should be a fun session. And as I mentioned earlier, we have every morning at 8 a.m. Eastern time, we're imagining the future together, doing something called collective journaling, where we journal for 90 minutes individually together in a room. That's on Patreon for Patreon supporters. You can check that out on the website, stoa.ca. So that being said, Jay, everyone, thank you so much for coming to STOA today. And we'll close out by listening to some Madonna.
Thanks, be well.